Okay, now you read it, and this I recommend would be the first thing you do when you get the text. Familiarize yourself with what is the text. Also, in the descriptor before, when it gives you the instructions, it will give you some indication of the nature of the text. So for the first one, the mock one, it is a journal paper. And for the second one, it is a biology student's assignment, written assignment. So those would be factors that you would keep in mind in terms of looking at the text and what it would tell you, what will be your expectations. First thing, how does this text compare with similar texts covered in class? Here, whatever text you have on the exam, you should be comparing, and I've told you this many times, and it will be a text that you can compare. It will be a text that will have some similarity with what you have already looked at. So in the material that you bring to the exam, hopefully you will be bringing the material of the kinds of texts that we have covered so you can indeed compare. The comparison is important. Ask yourself, what is the register of the text? Here you would be saying most likely that these are both academic texts. One, a journal paper. You would expect perhaps a bit more sophistication from a journal paper than if it is a student's written assignment in a class. Okay. Describe it in terms of field, tenor, and mode. So what does that mean? Field. What is it about? Well, it's in the case of the one, global warming. This is the journal paper. And simply that we can say for now. The other one is about mangroves and saving the mangroves and trying to argue why they should not be replaced by some kind of construction project. Tenor, who is the, not, should be, what is the function of the text? Sorry, what is the function of the text? In the case of global warming, what is the function of the text? I want you to ask yourself that question. What is its purpose? What is it trying to do? Is it persuading? Well, in fact, most academic work is trying to persuade. It is trying to make a point, to express some idea and give some support for the point that's been made. What is the function of the text? What's its purpose? Who is the target audience? Who is it being directed at? Mode. What is the mode? Is it written to be read? Both of these would be that. Okay, it's not written to be spoken, like some political speeches would be. It is definitely not extemporaneous spoken. Any observable patterns that you can find, then this is what you'll look at when you look at the tables, the transitivity, theme, and logical. Any particular features which would be expected given the register of the text. What are you expecting? Well, now your expectations should be like we have covered in class. And I'm going to just briefly review some of those points before I ask you to actually engage with doing this. And any deviation from the expectations, given what we expect, are there any things that you do not see? It's not always just what's there, it's also sometimes what's not there, right, that you're paying attention to. Okay, so you have mock exam 1 and mock exam 2. Now, this is how we're going to proceed this evening. I'm going to present a brief review of what is academic writing. And what you should be paying attention to is what you should be paying attention to when analyzing the mock exam texts, both of which are academic in nature. I want you to divide into two groups. Okay, so one group will be doing mock 1. And so if I could just now divide you, and we will just divide this way. So would you like to be on this side or that side? On this side, okay. So on this side from here, you are one group. You're doing mock 1. On this side, you are doing mock 2. I'm going to divide you as we have done. One doing mock 1, one doing mock 2. I want you to discuss among yourselves how to answer both sections A and B. Don't forget you do have section B, all right? And that is an important part of it. I want you to engage with each other, actually talk out and come to some, rather than you just working on it by yourself. You will do that when you have the exam. But now is a chance to learn from each other as well. And then you will present your findings to the class. You can decide how you want to do that. But I want your group to present something about what you have found. So if you want to put together some slides to do so, or you just want to use the whiteboard, to explain what it is you've done. Okay. Now, before you do this, I'd like to go through some things that I would have expected if you were doing this exam and you had these texts. You had a text like this. This is the material that I would have expected you to be referring to. That will help you to be able to go through it. These slides are all in material that I've given you. Remember last week I told you I have put these review PDFs, and all of it is now there in that folder. So you just can go through that. Print it, all right? Bring it with you because you don't know the nature of the text that you're going to analyze. So best you cover all the possibilities. All I tell you is that it will be a text that you can compare, and you should compare. Field tenor mode. You should be thinking about what is field tenor mode, how do we talk about it, and when you actually write your observations, write them in this framework. Field, what is it about? Tenor, who is engaging with who? What is the function? Who is the target audience? What's the mode? It is a register that you will be describing. Scientific writing, what we've been talking about in terms of the language of science, that is the language of academic writing, okay? We say the language of science, but it's true for the social sciences. It's true for any kind of real academic work. It is a register. So familiarize yourself with what is the nature of this register, academic. If it were what you would be looking at here, you'll remember we talked about this. What is this most highly valued model of scientific writing? A causes X, or A proves Y, where A and X and Y are all highly complex noun groups. A lot of nominalization, grammatical metaphor. And what do we mean by grammatical metaphor? You should be looking at these two texts then in terms of, do you find grammatical metaphor? Now that won't necessarily be in the tables. And this is another very important point I want to make. It's not just about hitting the tables, counting how many material processes, how many mental, etc. That is not just the end of it. When you're doing, if you're doing academic register, of course you're going to look for grammatical metaphor. Does it exist in your text? Does it not exist? Do you not see much of it? I think you're going to see something when you look at the journal paper and the student's writing. But you ought to be paying attention to this idea of what is grammatical metaphor. Verbs and adjectives becoming nouns, conjunctions becoming verbs. This is what you see normally in academic writing. Point I was making with these slides was simply that it has become more or less the dominant way of writing grammatical metaphor. What is grammatical metaphor? It's nominalization. It's a nominalized grammar where the focus is on noun phrases, noun groups that are very complex with a lot of descriptors and a lot of classifying adjectives and so forth. Do you remember this? When I talked about the academic writing. Now, if you had this text, this is the main thing that you should look at. This would be the first go-to in terms of what to look for. Remember, this was a rubric that was being used to identify how closely a student's writing was really accomplishing its purpose, and that is kind of academic writing. Now, this one, I would hope that this would be in your pile of material. Look at your material. I mean, if you see something like this and you can't really make it out when you print it, make sure you can read it, all right? What was it? The main focus, by the way, is here, the grammar. In this rubric, this is really where you want to pay attention, because this is where it is telling you the kinds of ways in which ideational meaning is represented lexicogrammatically. Elements within noun groups effectively describe and classify specialized terms, classifying adjectives, defining clauses. Verb groups express processes relevant to the genre, defining, classifying, cause and effect, reporting. These are the kinds of things you look for. Is it there in your text? Interpersonal. Because you're also, as we said, tenor, you are trying to persuade. So when you're trying to persuade, what are the ways in which one does so in an academic text? Again, the rubric gives some suggestions, interpersonal objective metaphors. Do you see those within the text? Do you see things like it is clear that there is a need for, how, if, and this is true for both of these texts here, both are intending to persuade. So then how do they put across their stance? How do they put it across to try to persuade the reader? How do they cite their sources? How is the material? How do they find authoritative sources and so forth? Textual meaning. Theme. How is theme used within the text? Now, you may not see it if you're just looking at what we've been identifying, what's in that table. Again, I'm going to make this point. Do not just rely on what is in those tables. you're going to also have to look beyond that to look for how choices of unmarked themes sustain orientation to the topic. This side, you're doing Mach 2, the mangroves. You see mangrove keep appearing as theme. But that's one thing that you'd be noticing. Grammatical metaphor. How do you identify, do you see grammatical metaphor in the text? Active versus passive voice. Abstract nouns used to generalize and track ideas. When it comes to academic writing, this rubric is excellent because it shows what are the kinds of features that you need to look for. Theme. Remember when Halliday did his analysis of Darwin's Origin of Species, and as he put it, he was trying to identify what was so special about the text. And what really struck him was Darwin's use of theme. And you remember how Halliday identified what were the kinds of sort of what occurs as theme. And he sort of identifies these in categories. And then he identified the new information. What occurs? Where does new information occur? Toward the end of the clause, right? So he went through the whole text, looked at theme, looked at new information. And he identified how in that final sentence, what was so special about it was that it brought together all of the various ideas that were expressed as theme or new information. The last sentence it combined everything that had been developed throughout the text itself. Of course, you're not going to be doing a theme analysis at this level. Of course not. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am saying is look at theme. And when you look at thematic progression. Thematic progression, what do I mean? Linear or continuous. Do you see the writer using thematic progression to develop the text? Grammatical metaphor. I hope it's clear to you. It's where you take, for example, here, what was all expressed in very verbal terms, verbal, and I'm using in the sense of verbs, and it sums up then as a something. It sums it up as a noun group. The education of girls preceded the acquisition of the vote by women. I want you to look for this. This is what you should be looking for in the sense of this kind of pattern. It's supposed to be there in scientific writing. Is it there in your text? Again, I make the point. You look for it. You find it, or you don't find it. Both are points that you can make. Okay. Some comments on the first text. One thing that struck me in the first was the amount of what we described before. A causes X, where you have nouns that are very dense and completely complex. So we have recent climate warming has resulted in. And that's exactly what Halliday was describing in terms of the language of science, being a recent climate warning has resulted in using a verb to connect up the two, a genetic shift toward the use of shorter, more southern day lengths. Quite long noun phrases. The same thing we can see here. The latitudinal variation in North American surface temperature is, using a relational verb, adaptive shifts in the timing of seasonal events should precede, and then again, another long, dense noun phrase. Exactly the kind of thing that we expect in academic writing, scientific text. Again, we see it here in paragraph 7. Same thing. So one thing that struck me about this is a journal paper, and as expected, it will be more sophisticated and follow what would be the expectation, and that is a great deal of nominalization, very dense, complex noun phrases with a lot of modification. So we have both phenotypic and genetic changes in the ability of great tits embedded to attract the seasonal availability of caterpillars. All that is like the circumstances theme. We see the verb show. All of this is meant to make a point. So all the examples show, and then continues with the effects of rapid climate warming, populations of many large animals with longer life cycles, smaller population sizes. So it would be it fits our expectation. Questions remain. The use of those kinds of phrases that put a little doubt into what was being said, but without actually saying that it's wrong, not so dogmatic. So that would be the interpersonal coming into it, being able to express an opinion, but slightly hedged. It is clear. Again, that same kind of construction we expect, which would be related to the tenor. When I looked at the logical structure, the total finite clauses, how many finite clauses are there? Before we can actually compare simple and complex, how do we find it? Well, I would go back to the theme table. Because remember, what do we analyze for theme? We analyze only those finite clauses, right? So what are how many finite clauses are there within the text? We can count it from the theme table. And I would count there to be 31 finite clauses. Now, simple clauses, I go back to the logical table, and I can see wherever there is no taxes relations, that would be a simple clause. There were 5. Simple clauses with embedding, well, that would be also indicated in the logical table. So I have 31 finite clauses. 5 of them are simple, so 16%. Simple clauses with embedding, only 4, 13%. How many are complex clauses then? Out of that 31, if I deduct the 9 that are here, 5 and 4, I know how many complex clauses I have. So I got this number from the theme table. This is from the logical table. Likewise, this number is based on 31 minus 9. So I have 22 complex clauses, which make up 71%. So 71% is complex clauses involving some kind of taxis relations. Now, how many are paratactic? Well, there you can count them, and you can see how many relations there are. 12 paratactic, or 86%. Now, that was striking to me. I did not expect that. It's more paratactic than hypotactic. Now, that was a bit of a surprise to me. Hypotaxis only 14%. Note those things that are not what one would expect. In academic writing, you'd expect it to be more paratactic. Theme, well, just to say a bit more for these, you already discussed theme, and I think that would be basically how you approach it. when I use this, when I use these on the exam, because this was an actual exam, all right? Almost everyone did number one. Very few people ventured to number two. And in fact, number one is more obvious. But here, what I would have suggested is illustrate your discussion with examples from text analyzed in clauses. Looking at some of the examples that we have that illustrate, like you remember the Hu Jintao's speech, Obama's, and so forth. Then I would expect sort of examples from what you have seen before, all right, that illustrate the role of theme in the development of the text. How would you explain to someone who's unfamiliar with systemic functional linguistics? Well, how can this be helpful and applied in society? You'll remember I gave you the illustration earlier about the development of that rubric for how to teach academic writing. Well, that would be one thing that we could mention. Translation. Remember the court case, looking at how the difficulties faced by the interpreter and on the basis of what we learn from a linguistic point of view about lexical density, complex clauses, and so on. And the difficulty there was because the judge was basically reading something that had been written. Mach 2. Here again, what was the student trying to do? The student was trying to persuade that they should not proceed with this construction project. And so we see, again, kind of hedging, it seems, not saying it outright, a careful evaluation. So you're saying, you're giving yourself some kind of authority here. It's a careful evaluation, and we'll show. You'll notice that both texts use that verb, show, because the evidence is meant to show something favorable. In this text, there isn't the nominalization like there was in the first one. There isn't that nominalized grammar. There isn't A causes X, where A and X are dense, complex noun groups. You don't see that here. But what I did notice here is a thematic progression which is very much continuous. Mangroves, the mangrove trees. It's a very continuous thematic progression. Likewise, we get here, habitat, this place, the habitat. Well, that would also be related to cohesiveness. Again, what was more interesting to me about the second text was we have fungi being used, continuous thematic progression, but we do have a thematic progression of linear as well. We have this, I'm not sure how to pronounce the word really. Detritus materials are the food for animals such as worms, snails, oysters, etc. These animals, well, that's linear thematic progression. Fungi is repeated. Here we have again linear thematic progression. Again, I'm not sure how to pronounce some of these scientific words. Mangroves, continuous. In the second text, I found the thematic progression more interesting. It was more obvious. Again, continuous thematic progression. Mangroves keeps being mentioned. Lexical cohesion. Again, I did the analysis for the logical. And again, I'm using the theme table. I recommend that's how you proceed. Use the theme table just to analyze and find out how many finite clauses are there. All right, 46. Now, simple, 4 out of that 46, 9%. Simple clauses with embedding, 15%. Complex clauses, take away 46 minus 11, there's 35 out of 46. 76% are complex clauses. So what do you see different than the previous one? What you see is the paratactic 35%, hypotactic 65%. This would sort of fit more the expectation. This one was very well explained in terms of what is the most basic lexicogrammatical unit, the clause. The clause is identifiable in terms of the grammar that realizes the meaning. And when Halliday uses the word grammar, what is he talking about? He's talking about how meaning is realized in terms of transitivity, process, participant, circumstance, how it is realized textually in terms of theme, and how it is realized logically in terms of paratactic, hypotactic, and so forth. What is an anti-text? Well, here, if you had the materials on hand about what I talked about Trump and David Foster Wallace, this would be an ideal one to do. It would be quite straightforward, because what is the anti-text? It is what goes against our expectations. Trump's speak doesn't sound like a politician, doesn't sound presidential. It is the anti-text. He doesn't sound like anybody else in that role. David Foster Wallace, his commencement speech was very much unlike what one expects in a commencement speech. It wasn't meant to be sort of motivating. It was, in fact, saying, try not to be so self-centered in your life. Well, you've been very hardworking today, and I appreciate those of you that have participated. You did very well. My expectations were met very well with how you dealt with it, and it gives me some confidence in terms of what I can expect to see on the exam, and I hope it gives me some confidence about how we're going to approach it. Don't forget to give me your logic. What are we doing today? Transitivity analysis before you leave. Please put your name on it.